to our second community meeting for Energize Langley. We are here to talk about community resilience and how we can build local clean energy systems that will support us in good times and bad. We will preview the many community sites that we are considering for this study and get your feedback. As you learned at the first meeting, we launched Energize Langley in response to our precarious situation. We have frequent power outages, and they're only getting worse as we feel the impacts of a changing climate. We're studying how to build islands of locally generated clean power to clean up our energy supply and provide power when the electric grid inevitably goes out. I'm Meredith Penny, the Director of Community Planning for the City of Langley. The mayor couldn't be here tonight, so she asked me to represent the city here. If you live in Langley or anywhere on South Whidbey, you know that we live at the end of a very long extension cord, and our connections to resources on the mainland are dependent on bridge or ferry connections. And we know that weird weather, winter storms, heat waves are increasing as we experience the impacts of human-caused climate change. So we're launching Energize Langley to learn how we as a community can begin to build islands of resilience, locally generated power, and a locally stronger community. The Energize Langley work is funded by a grant from the Washington State Department of Commerce. We have a great team on Energize Langley. So I'm with the City of Langley and I'm managing the overall study, but we also have an outreach and engagement team. They're supporting us from Kicking Gas and Site Story, and we have engineering expertise from Cascadia Renewables. In addition, we have local volunteers and partners from South Whidbey Prepares, plus many of the sites that we are looking at for microgrid implementation. Folks from those sites have also provided support. So with that, I will turn it over to Joan, who is our project manager, and she will tell us about the agenda tonight.
Thank you, Meredith. Awesome. All right. Great. Well, we're so glad that you're here. Thank you for joining us. And we're in our new library, which is just a beautiful location. So thanks for being here. This is our agenda. So we're kind of doing the welcome right now. In a minute, I'll talk about the first meeting that we had on October 1st at the community center. And then we'll learn from the tech team about the desktop analysis results. So excited to see those. Then we're going to do a short visualization exercise with Ellen and to kind of just get us grounded and so that we're ready to kind of pick some sites that we want for our community. And then we'll do a group activity. That's kind of why you have these, the chairs are kind of like in pods because you're going to be having a lot of conversations with your community members, and that'll be pretty fun. And then we'll do some Q&A, have some announcements, and then there's going to be prizes at the end. So we've got a whole bunch of prizes here that we'll give out. Great. All right. So I wanted to just start off by saying, we are in these little pods, and we wanted you to have a quick conversation with your pod mates. And the question is, let's see. Okay, so what excites you about microgrids? You can talk about that with the people at your location, or just what question are you coming to this meeting with? So let's just take a few minutes and just talk amongst yourselves about that. So I just wanted to recap kind of what we found out from the first meeting. Again, that was on October 1st at the community center, and we had 46 people there. So it was a really good turnout. There were, I think, 11 people online. And so we got a lot of interest. We just kind of wanted to celebrate the launch of this program, and we got to meet the team, and we did some fun things, like we had a photo booth and really good pies and stuff like that. So it was a great celebration. And then, some people are asking, what are microgrids? So we really got to let people know about those. And microgrids are basically on one site, one structure within our town. It'll be solar panels plus battery storage. So we're going to be choosing 3 sites that we can do microgrids for our town, just to build resilience and also reliability for the grid. So does that make sense? I know people were coming with that question today. What is a microgrid? And you know what I love is that, I was today at Repurpose Woodby, and people were coming in and they were saying that they were excited to come to this, and they know about microgrids, and it's kind of cool to have that education and have that knowledge now that it's just kind of a common word that we're saying in our town. And reliability versus resilience. So as I understand it, and the tech team will let us know some more, but reliability means that when we have a microgrid, it's really helping to keep the grid reliable, basically, yeah, so that like the day-to-day actions, the more grids that we have, the more reliable the power is. And what's kind of cool, in a little bit, you'll see this map of like all the sites that we've chosen. And when Derek and I saw that, we're like, oh, we wish that we could have like all those microgrids, because like, how could we be our own like self-sufficient neighborhood, basically? I mean, it just seems like, it just makes you feel like you're more resilient and you're more in a reliable place, I guess. Yeah, so then resilience is when things go down, like if there's a power outage or an emergency, if we have those microgrids, then it builds resilience. So we can, we'll be safer, we'll have power for us to, get through the storm, basically. And then we did a community exercise in October with the group, and we asked these questions. What are your personal priorities during outages? How do we support neighbors, and where do we go for refuge? So some of the results from that are, so people were really concerned about safety. That's really a big priority. We have an aging population here. I think the average age is 69.9 or 69.5. So we just want to be safe. A lot of people have medical equipment that they need to have power to operate, and people want to be warm, they want to have food, they want to be able to charge their phones and get access to the internet. So those are some things that bubbled up during that activity. So how do we support our neighbors? So this was a cool thing that I found out, is that we have this whole radio network here on Woodby Island, and I guess it's very robust. And they actually have a contact list of people who have medical needs, who might need help during a power outage. They also test the network pretty regularly, so actually weekly. And so that's kind of nice to know that that's happening on our island. And then we have South Woodby Prepares, which, who all knows about South Woodby Prepares? Raise your hand if you do. Okay, yeah, it's a great effort that's going on the island, just to keep us resilient, to keep us prepared in case of an emergency. And they're building little community groups, basically, where the community can kind of help each other. And my friend Linda, she's actually had like several block parties from like her neighborhood group, and I think it's pretty cool that people are getting to know each other. And she's like, oh, that person, does this. So like you kind of get to know each other, plus you get to know what people can help with in an emergency. And then where do we go for refuge? So we come here. This is a place where people like to come when the power's out. And also a couple cafes that have propane, or sorry, not propane, sorry, I shouldn't say that bad word. No, they have, oh my gosh, generators. Yeah, so they have generators, so they keep us fed at the Star Store and at the Brayburn Cafe. There's good coffee there that people don't get. Also the Brookhaven Community Room. Brookhaven is a community for elders and people with that have some medical needs or special needs, and so they can go to that community room to get warm and fed. Also in Coopville, there's Cedar and Salt that has a generator, and then a lot of people go off island if the power outage is going on for a few days. So that's kind of what we learned at the last meeting, and then today we're at meeting 2. And what we're going to be doing, we've identified, today we're going to have you all help us to identify the sites that we want to move forward with. And we've identified 11 sites, and so that's pretty exciting. And we're going to, these are places that we could have potential microgrids at. So again, the solar plus battery storage. And tonight the tech team is going to share the desktop analysis results, which is really cool, and you'll get to learn about the different sites. And then you as the community will weigh in and weigh in on your favorites, basically. So we're going to take that vote along with our Energize Langley vote, which is the tech team plus the outreach team. And then we're also going to ask the city folks, and when I say city folks, I mean the staff and the elected officials at the city. They're going to have 33% of the vote. And then between those three, we're going to come up with 3 recommendations of the sites that we can pursue a feasibility study for each of those 3 sites. Yep. And then we're going to recommend that to the city council, and then they'll approve that and sign off on it. Yeah. So, okay, I hope that makes sense. And
who pays for that?
What's that?
Who pays?
Oh, so this is all being paid for by the grant that that the city won. It was $250,000 from the Washington State Department of Commerce. Yep.
So how big is this battery storage?
We'll get to that. Yeah, we'll get to that next.
I'm so curious.
Yeah, I know. Good, I'm glad you are. Yeah, Dominique's, thanks, Dominique is on our city council. She just won. I mean, yeah. See, isn't this cute? I just love this map, like seeing all of our sites. So these are, I think now the tech team will come up. We got Callum and Marcus from Cascadia Renewables, and they're going to start us off with the analysis. Thank you.
Thank you, Joan.
Sure.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Hello,
Give it up for Joan.
Oh,
Hello, everyone. Very lovely to be back. I was down here in October talking to you all the first time, which was a really energizing and fantastic meeting. I brought my business partner, Marcus, with me this time, Marcus Verter. He has been actually involved far before we formed Cascadia Renewables, very involved in designing solar systems here in Langley. So we were driving into town tonight, he was pointing out all of the systems that he's worked on in the past. So nice to be back. What you can see here is the initial series of sites that we looked at through our desktop analysis. I want to explain a little bit about the purpose of this. So there are 3 detailed feasibility studies that we're able to provide to the City of Langley. That is that is a process and a product that ends in a really clear idea of the pros and cons and construction hurdles and really a bid and construction ready system that you could choose to pursue construction funding for. So what we're not talking about tonight is choosing a system to install. We're talking about choosing which systems to look at in a great amount of detail to potentially be ready to seek funding for and install in the future. The purpose of this initial screening effort is to look at a large number of potential sites that are of interest to the community and try and identify on the front end, are there any that we can immediately say there are going to be some challenges here that might limit their ability to be a feasible site in the future, in order to make sure that we can save our focus for those sites that might be more feasible. So that's one portion of it. And the other portion of it is to give all of you a sense of what resources you already have in your community. Where are the places that people are gathering, or where people are open to being a place to be gathered at. So dual purpose for that. What we're going to do now is run through these 11 sites at a pretty high level. There are detailed slides that have our notes from designers and details about the site that you'll be able to access afterward. What we're going to do is we're going to go through the first site, reading through and showing you how to look at that desktop analysis, and then we're going to skim through the rest of the sites, giving the high level information in order to give ourselves plenty of time to get into group discussions and try and get to a shortlisting session. So do feel free to think of your questions and jump in at the end once we've run through these. With those, I'm happy to support.
Wonderful. Great. So the first site in the portfolio analysis is the Brookhaven Housing Authority. So it sounds like many of you are familiar with the site. And apologize for the graininess. This is much more legible in the actual portfolio analysis that will be available. But what you see here in this top right image is the irradiance map and conceptual solar design. What is irradiance? Irradiance is a measurement that we take using kind of a complex analysis of LiDAR that gives us the height of all of the trees and structures in the area, and then simulates 365 days of sun path throughout the year and maps out the concentrated sunlight on a roof and the total generating capacity of that site. And so what you see underneath the image is in January what the generating capacity of this potential project would look like compared to June. The coloration of this chart has to do with the kind of performance of the site. So the darker the color, the more kind of annual shade you have at the facility. How is this quantified? We would quantify this as the total solar resource fraction. TSRF is the acronym that's used. And what the TSRF is what is the percentage of efficiency this site has compared to an ideal, kind of perfect optimized site in its location. So, facing the correct azimuth at the right tilt without any shade, this site is at or below 70%. So it's not ideal. You can see, quite a bit of dark coloring here. What you're looking for really on an ideal site is that bright orange that you see kind of on the north side. So you can see the reason why we're getting a lower TSRF here is you've got these large trees to the south, east, and west that are causing that kind of wintertime shading, which is bringing down our solar kind of productivity in the winter. And sometimes that's okay. We have really long, productive summer months, as you can see here. But in a resilience application and for a microgrid, you really want to have a balance of generating capacity and strong generating capacity in the winter. If you don't have that with solar, then you might need to augment that with some other generating resource, whether that's a generator or something else, in order to give you the kind of goal of autonomy and resilience that you would want for the site.
So we have a generator.
Right, and so that would be something we would want to look at if we were to select this site, is what are all of the different generating resources at the facility, and what is the carbon content of operating that system in a resilient scenario. And then what we do is called a survivability analysis, where we model all of the different technologies. And really, when you boil down what a microgrid is, it's balancing the supply of energy with the demand for energy. And so what we're looking at is the suite of tools we have, the different paintbrushes we have to do that kind of balancing at the facility.
So does that only supply them, Brookhaven, or would it supply Langley?
It's a really good question.
Yep.
So there's a few things I'll just say is everything Marco said is correct. That is what we are about to do when we do our detailed feasibility study. And what we're trying to screen for on the front end is what can we tell just from a desktop as to what we think the generating resource might be and where we think our parameters are. So we haven't actually done the analysis for this site in terms of balancing various different types of generation. What we can tell right from the offset is there's a very limited solar resource on this site, so it would be pretty reliant on other forms of generation to be a meaningful resilience asset. In answer to your question, pretty much every site we're looking at initially, we're looking at as a single isolated site, a single node microgrid. So we're not looking in this study at connecting multiple nodes yet across the grid. That's absolutely something we can look at in the future, but each of these are intended as isolated sites to begin with.
Are they going to have the equipment necessary to connect the different single node grids?
It's another great question. So what we would do with when we get through to the detailed feasibility study, we'd have a better idea on a site-by-site basis whether or not it could provide more value to the grid or less value to the grid, and that would be something that we'd be trying to quantify then. What we could do in advance is before any installation, we could look at the communication protocols that we would want any equipment that was installed to be able to follow to better allow it to integrate with the utility and with the grid. So we can write a lot of those parameters into a bid specification, but at this stage, I would start by working on the assumption that each of these are just going to be a single isolated location to begin with in the first phase of their life, and then potentially future could be more useful in the
So you mean
context.
it's just that building?
Just that building.
Just that building. And I think a really good way of thinking about it is, balancing supply and demand. And so the first thing we'll do with the detailed feasibility study for the 3 sites that are selected is really dive deep into the electrical characteristics for that facility. So understanding the 2 components of electrical supply and demand are how much energy is used throughout the day at the site. So that's, how long are your electrical loads on and running, and what does that mean in total kilowatt hours of energy? And then also, second is the demand for electricity. And so that is how much is the peak, what is the peak amount of time you're using power throughout the entire year for that site. And so what we do is a really deep dive on quantifying the energy and demand capacities for a facility over an entire year period, and then start to dive into optimizations of the technologies we would need to apply that do that balance in supply and demand.
What we're looking at here, there's multiple different sections to this report. The first section of each of these pages is just some basic site information. We then look at the utility hosting capacity, so we're seeing for the larger sites if there are any limitations in terms of the capacity of the local grid to host a larger system. We then have the details of the PV system that Marcus was just going through in detail here. That's telling you your total solar resource, your annual production estimate, and a rough cost that we might imagine for the PV system. We then have notes from our designer for each site, saying what they've seen. And then here we have initial comments on the battery energy storage system, the kind of range of sizes we might expect to see for this kind of site as well. So these are all very preliminary because, again, it's a quick snapshot to try and help shortlist which ones we're going to look at in more detail. So that was Brookhaven. The next one we were asked to look at was Fifth Street Commons, Condominium Association. Main takeaways here, it's a relatively unshaded site, so you can just see compared with the last slide, there's very little of the purple in the irradiance map, so it's a better producing site. You're obviously still going to get a pretty strong seasonal variation in production because we are in Washington after all. I think the main thing that we noted here is it's going to be a relatively small system, so it could certainly be appropriate for supporting these buildings, but there's a limited capacity in these buildings for hosting large numbers of people. So we might expect that a PV system here might range somewhere in the sort of 25 kilowatt range in terms of size, and could be, let's say, $75,000 to $125,000 for the PV system. And then the battery system that could go with that might be a 15 to 30 kilowatt or 60 kilowatt hour system that might range in the $60,000 to $120,000 range. So overall, maybe somewhere between $200,000 to $250,000. So from a technical standpoint, this site could produce pretty well, but it's going to be a relatively small system just due to the physical capacity constraints on site, how much space there is. In contrast, if we look at the South Whitby Community Center, what you can immediately see is you have a huge roof, it's completely unshaded, so you can fit a very large PV system that can produce an awful lot of energy annually. We haven't even gone on to a large portion of the building. And in addition, there's ample space for a very large ground-mounted battery system that could go with that. Now, whether or not this is a useful site is not for me to determine for you as a community, but what we can say is you've got the space here and the production capacity here to be able to build a pretty large asset that could generate a lot of power and sustain the building for a large amount of time.
And the buildings are old. That was what came up at the last meeting. They're
Absolutely.
deteriorating already.
That's true.
Yeah.
We understand.
Hang on, and before we jump on this one, the previous project, the kind of rough size of the batteries, that was one of the questions we heard earlier, is kind of rough size of the battery, that was about a 60 to 75 kilowatt hour battery. In terms of actual footprint of that battery system, which includes the batteries themselves as well as all of the protection equipment and safety equipment, imagine about the size of a small electric car. It actually probably a little smaller than that. That's roughly the size of the battery of your large Nissan Leaf or Tesla Model 3 or Y or whatever.
Just to say the size of the battery, we're not talking about the physical size of the battery, we're talking about the capacity. The physical size of the battery might be more like a fridge, a large fridge.
A large refrigerator for this size system. And now for this project, we're talking about a system size that's about 4 to 5 times the capacity of that, and that would be about a 10-foot by 12-foot mounted pad outside that's about 8 feet tall. So now you're getting to kind of a large metal box that would be fenced off and protected that we would want outside. And so kind of a step change in difference in size of the system. This system would have kind of integrated controls, safety, shutdown equipment, fire suppression equipment, all integrated into it. It's the type of system you would bring in, forklift down, and then configure for the site specifically. So there's a little bit of a difference in the project types here, And just noting the scale here is what's different.
Absolutely, point well made. So the Upper Langley Co-Housing Homeowners Association, you can kind of see is sorting more into the smaller end of the project range that we were looking at. That was going to be probably one of the smallest solar systems that we could see for any site in terms of what would fit. So you're probably going to be looking at something like a 10 kilowatt solar system there, and a relatively small battery, again, much more like that large fridge kind of size battery.
This is like the type of project size you would see on a residence.
With that said, it is excellent solar production for the site because it's a very large unshaded array. So a smaller system, but potentially quite a functional, well-producing system.
And how many people would that serve?
It's about the same as like a residence, right?
One resident.
That's right. Yep.
Thank you.
Back on the other end of the spectrum, again, much more like the community centre, we've got the Whitby Island Fairgrounds and Event Centre. This is the largest of the PV systems that we think you could fit, and when we're talking about a system of this kind of size, that's where this utility hosting capacity starts to be an important factor. When we're looking at much larger systems, that's where you can run into issues interconnecting in the grid. In this instance, we're not seeing any issues there, so there shouldn't be any problem from a grid perspective being able to interconnect this. Very, very good production on this site as well. Very little in terms of shade. You can see some up on the northeast end of the property, just shading some of those roofs, but in general, pretty unshaded. Obviously, you have lots of space here, so there's the capacity for a much larger battery energy storage system. And so this is getting to your point earlier, Tim, when you're looking at the community centre and when you're looking at the fairgrounds, that's where there is the physical space to potentially put a system that's larger that could have more benefit to the grid if you wanted to look at that. So there's just the physical space to do that on a site like this.
And the recharging ability of the array, the solar array, and potential generator or other generating assets at the site. So the footprint of this battery, we get an idea of the footprint of the solar. The footprint of this battery is more like the size of a large
Container.
Yeah, like a shipping container or a semi-truck load, right? And so again, it's more of an industrial system that would be brought in, and you would have kind of large electrical equipment transforming that and distributing it out to each of the different facilities with probably some kind of load switching protocol so that we are prioritizing the essential loads. This type of system we've seen implemented around the state for like mass care facilities. So this is where you would take, large swaths of the community potentially and bring them in an emergency where we have an indefinite period of autonomy, where we're planning for a long, undefined outage. So again, a slightly different scale, but kind of shows you the range of projects. And to Callum's point earlier, and the questions earlier, absolutely in the future, you could potentially be networking all of these independent systems together. That would require quite a bit of coordination with the local utility. But it is something that we want to be thoughtful of when we're selecting these sites and thinking about what is the most benefit to the community now and what is the roadmap the community wants to take in the future. So this might be a really important site, but isn't the right site today. Or if the infrastructure at the site isn't quite right and we need new roofs now, this one might be a good one to put on the list 4, 5, or 6 years down the road. So those are the types of questions that we really want to hear from all of you, those insights, so that we can help provide the technical guidance.
So, and I will say as a general thing, when we're doing our detailed feasibility studies for the specific sites, at that point we're doing site visits and we're documenting everything on the site. We're identifying whether or not it needs a new roof. We're looking at the structural capacity. We're looking at the electrical capacity. We're putting together construction estimates and potential upgrade estimates. That is the purpose of the detailed feasibility study, is to try and take something from a notion to a constructible system. And that process takes multiple months per site and hundreds of hours from our team. So the purpose here for tonight is to try and figure out where do we want to direct hundreds of hours of design time and research in order to get the best overall benefit for Langley. I would say this is pretty good as a very stark very sort of stark view on one end of the spectrum what a very poor performing site is. I'll just draw your attention to this TSRF. The lowest site we've seen until now was a 70% TSRF, and now we're down at a 57% TSRF. That's generally in the range where we would normally say to somebody, it's going to be very hard to make solar work on this site from a production standpoint. And so in this instance, I think what we would probably say is it could be a very useful community asset, but there's going to be real challenges relying on solar production on this site for any meaningful generation for a lot of the year. What you're seeing as we go through is that a lot of these sites are relatively small and can be potentially multi-purpose. Some have very specific emergency support functions. So the Chamber of Commerce and restrooms, as an example, it's a relatively small site, but it may well serve a very specific function in an emergency that doesn't require a lot of energy. So that's the other thing to think about, is not just can we fit a large system on this site or a small system on this site, but can we fit the appropriate sized system on this site for the function that this building needs to play for us in an outage. The fire station serves a very, very obvious function. So the main thing we're trying to do here is make sure that in an extended outage, you would have emergency services with power. In terms of the technical side of this, it's a pretty fantastic site in terms of solar resource. There's no shade around. You've got a very large roof, certainly pretty significant production given the size of the site, and there's ample space in order to potentially fit a relatively large battery energy storage system to support that site. So initially, from a technical standpoint, this looks very feasible, certainly one that could be looked at in more detail.
And again, this is in that kind of like large shipping container-esque size project. We've seen fire districts and associations get funded from Commerce in the past as well. In the context of resilience, if you haven't read the Island County Comprehensive Emergency Management Plan, that's one of the documents that's really important in coordinating an emergency response. Emergency support and emergency medical services is kind of obvious when you think about emergency management and planning for that. But there's things on that plan that you might not immediately think of, like how do we process human waste in an emergency? How do we process water systems? How do we, do communication and mass coordination? So we talked about the radio systems and the radio network. Are we making sure that those systems are powered? It's all really critical, and we want to think about the emergency support functions in the context of energy and how are we delivering energy to those systems, no matter big scale or small. And I think that's really counter, I think maybe to sometimes how you approach these projects, but small can be really meaningful in an emergency as big can.
In the right place.
In the right place, that's right.
So do you want to talk through the PV on this one?
Yeah.
I think you originally did that.
So yeah, this is the building that we're sitting in right now. So obviously an important community building and a place of potential refuge. So for the library and the city hall, not only could it be a place of refuge, a place where the bathroom facilities or warming or cooling could be available, but also maintaining the city's administrative functions in an emergency could be really critical. And a part of emergency management is communication, so maintaining the ability to get notices out and whatnot to the public. So there's multiple emergency support functions that could fit inside of this project potentially. The major constraint here is space, right? And so when we're talking about the battery system size here, we're talking about, again, quite a large battery and not a whole lot of available space on the exterior of these buildings to site that battery. So that's a hurdle that we would need to overcome if we were to take this project on as a detailed feasibility analysis.
And the other thing I would just say is that while you don't have very much shade, you have relatively steep east-west facing roofs, which do impact the production a little bit as well. So in theory, quite an important community resource. The production will be slightly impacted, but it's not too shady, but yeah, really a very, very challenging to see where we could fit the necessary storage.
The last thing I'd say about kind of the orientation of the solar is if you think about a south-facing solar panel, that's going to generate probably the most amount of electricity year-round, but it'll be generating that electricity in the middle of the day. an east and west facing array. An east facing array will be generating the majority of its electricity in the morning. A west facing array, majority of the electricity will be generated in the afternoon. So when we do a deep dive on the load profile and the energy usage of a facility, sometimes the demand peaks are in the morning and the afternoon, and so it's actually more advantageous in that situation to site and orient the panels where we're getting less production annually, but more production when we need it in the context of an emergency. So that's why the goals of the community and what we're trying to solve for are really important from the technical kind of engineering side.
And I think this is actually really well illustrated on this site because you have a large south-facing roof, but you also have east and west-facing roofs, and you have a little bit less of a differentiation between the winter and summer production as well in this production curve. So it just helps you show that on summer we had a very extreme difference. While there's still a significant difference, those parameters are brought in a little bit on this site here. This is St. Hubert's Church. Say there's space for a pretty significant PV array, and there is parking that could potentially be used for a relatively large BESS as well. Obviously, as a larger site, it could support more community members coming to it. And so this would be an example of potentially a multi-use facility the community is already going to that looks to have both the production potential and the space to put a battery to be able to be considered relatively useful. And then the final one that we're looking at here is the South Whitby Children's Centre and Preschool. Again, there is some shade around the site, but not too much. You've got, again, that pretty blended production between south, east, and west, and there is space on site for a larger battery, though in this instance we would imagine you'd probably only need a relatively small one in order to back up that one site.
But that would only be for the one site. Is that what you just said?
So all of these are just for the one site. Every single system we're just considering as a single site for now. It doesn't mean that they can't interact with the grid in the future, but right now looking at them as one site. The next part of this, what you've seen is a very wide range of different sites. Some are really, really small, almost residential size. Some are much larger, like the fairground, and could potentially have shipping container sized storage and very large PV arrays. What we need you as a community to now do is think about what kinds of systems do you want? What do you want to prioritize as a community? Are there small sites with specific functions that are really meaningful? Or are you more interested in developing larger sites that can potentially play a bigger role in future grid demand programs and can be a mass care facility? That is not our role as consultants to tell you where these assets should be sited. That's absolutely the community's conversation that needs to happen now. And then from that, we can go away and then try and do a more detailed design for you on wherever you think the best sites would be for us to look at in more detail. So what happens next? So where we're at right now is looking at all of these sites and saying, well, which 3 sites do we want to look at in more detail? Once you let us know which those are, our team is going to go away. We're going to conduct detailed site visits. We're going to gather usage information, structural information, roof age information, electrical information, and we're going to try and do a few things. First, we're going to find out and design what size battery would you need and what size PV system would you need in order to meet whatever the stated goals are for that site. So if you're saying this is a site that normally is empty, but in an emergency is going to become a mass care facility, then we're going to try and estimate what that usage is going to look like and design a system for it, as an example. If it's a site that is just it's a smaller site and we're just trying to keep it operational, doing exactly what it does already, all day, every day, then we can just design according to 100% of its normal usage, as an example.
And the, using the kind of example we used earlier about balancing supply and demand, we want to do that daily. We also want to do that seasonally. And so we're thinking about, and simulating what does an outage look like in the dead of winter when we have really low solar production. What does that mean? What are the goals and needs at that facility? And what are the services that the facility is providing? And how does that look? And how is that different than in the summertime when you have a whole lot of solar resource? So that is a fairly complicated bit of arithmetic that goes in to determining those the answers to those questions, and we'll be able to do all of that in the detailed feasibility study.
Once we've done that initially, we get back with the community and we show them those designs and we show them all the assumptions that have gone into it, and we say, did we get this right? Is this how you see this site being used in summer and winter? Do we need to tweak this at all? And we run through that design process a few times until we've got just the right size design. Then we will go through and look at all the construction hurdles that you might come across. What could go wrong in the construction? What additional work needs to be done in order to make this feasible. And we'll put together a construction budget for the system. At that point, written up into a final study, we come back to the community and we say, okay, here are the 3 shortlisted sites that you gave us. Now we've done a really detailed analysis of it, and we can talk through exactly what function they would have, what the budget would be, what it would mean to maintain those systems over time, and how they would be used in an outage. And from there, the community can decide which it wants to prioritize seeking funding for and potentially implementing, if any.
All right, thanks again, everyone. We're just gonna have a minute to clear our heads and think a lot about what we just heard. So we're gonna do just a 1-minute visualization. One thing I wanted to do, no matter what scale the site, we had some wonderful people step forward and say, we wanna help. And so all of those sites are still valid. They may not be the ones that are prioritized this time around, but the great thing is you have community members that really care, that wanna contribute to the community. And we just want to thank everyone who stepped forward with those sites and shared positive energy around resilience in this community. I say our community because we've been up here enough in recent months that we feel very connected. And so Martin and I are really grateful that Kiki Gas added us to the team. I'm Ellen, you met me in the last meeting. So whether you want to stay in your seat or if you want to stretch, we're just going to take 1 minute to visualize what a resilient Langley is for you, and also for all the EMTs and the first responders who may or may not live here. So let's think about them because they are a priority of service as well as we consider these sites. So we're just going to take 1 minute to imagine a resilient Langley. Tonight happens to be in indigenous culture of the Salish Sea, it is the supermoon. And the supermoon in indigenous culture means clarity. So this is the perfect night for us to meet and think about clarity and think about what we're going to prioritize in our community. So let's just take 1 minute, however you want to do your visualization, sitting or standing. Think about the positive outcomes, and then we'll move on to voting.
Voting.